Hi everyone, in this tutorial I'm going to show you how to fade the fur for a head and shoulder type portrait. Now my first step here is to continue the layer of fur where the detail is still going to be established. Once I've got that in, I've now got a guideline on where I then need to blend the lower section of fur. The reason I decide to do this is if I start with the blend initially on the lower section, I find then that the head and shoulder portrait has actually been cropped too low because we jump into that blur far too soon. Now the amount of blur here that I'm adding and at what point I start the blur is going to depend on the composition and the angle of the reference photo. Now because this was a side view, I wanted to have a little bit more of a diagonal slope which was then faded rather than more of the circular or rounded head and shoulder portrait, which would typically be more so if that dog was looking directly at the camera. Now regardless of the angle, I would still follow these key steps. So where I've got that darkest black, that's still going to be where the detail will eventually be overlapped on top. But when I'm working with this darker grey for the outer edge, having a slightly lighter value in here is going to help with that blend even more. Now with pastels, because of how easy it is to blend this medium, you can certainly blend black into your paper colour and create the fade that way. But I do find from the trial and error and the many different portraits that I've drawn, working with a lighter value here on this lower section does help to create an even softer blur, which I really like for these faded head and shoulder portraits. One thing you'll notice when I'm using the eye makeup applicator sponge is that I'm turning it on the opposite side where the edge is completely clean, so that I'm using that to fade that pastel even more. Because once that eye makeup applicator or the soft tool sponge, whichever you're using, once that's picked up a lot of darker graphite, it can actually still create more individual darker marks, which we want to avoid. So for example here, I'm using the darker, more dirtier side of that eye makeup applicator, and now I've turned it over, you can see the darker side visible. And as I've flipped that over, that's now enabling me to then soften that very lighter section without using the darker pastel that's on this sponge. Now flipping the applicator to more of a cleaner side seems like a very minor thing, but it does have a very big impact to the level of blur that we're creating. Now if I wanted this blend here to be even softer, I could go over the top with a paintbrush, and that will help just to pull the last remaining lighter layers of pastel right into then my dark grey Pastelmat colour. Now making sure that the paintbrush you're using is clean and it doesn't have any other pastel potentially from other projects is important. For example, if I'd have used that brush on some of the greenery in a different project and it wasn't clean, then that green is going to get pushed into the blended edge of this fur. So of course that is something that we do want to avoid. Now this section of the fur where I've come in with the black, it now creates a little bit too much harshness. I've lost some of that soft blur. But that's okay because I still want to establish the right balance of detail versus blend. So now when I come back in with my pastel pencils, you'll see that some of those lighter midtones that I'll eventually be adding will be added right in this midsection, which will help to provide that softness. Now it's at this point here where I think blending a faded head and shoulder portrait can then get rushed. It's very easy to leave it like this, but it does look unfinished. Now despite this being a blend, I still want to be making sure that I'm giving it the right amount of time. Because there's a blurry look to it, it doesn't mean then that we can get this done within seconds or a few minutes. Especially when I'm trying to gradually shape this part of the faded chest. If I do feel like I need to adjust the composition, I need to have a little bit more chest on the lower corner, potentially a little bit more visible, then I want to be making sure that I go back and spend those last few minutes adjusting that. Now one of my biggest tips when fading the fur like this is to not get too carried away with adding lots of detail early on, because if we then go back in and realise we have to overblend that, we've spent potentially hours of time adding in detail that's not necessary. Which is why I've established the blend first and then I'm coming back in adding my details over the top. Now in the next 10-15 seconds you're going to see that I'm going to come back in with my darker pencils and work with a little bit more of a darker blur. The reason being, as I started incorporating more of my lighter details here, I felt like they weren't having the right degree of visibility, and that is an indication that the layers underneath aren't dark enough. This would apply for any portrait. It doesn't just have to be the faded section that I'm working on here. Now, the other reason why this is so important during the faded section of a drawing is that we don't actually want to be putting in lots of bright highlights on this lower edge, because that is enough to pull focus away from the face. So I do hope this short video has been useful. If it was, I'd be very grateful if you could give it a like and a thumbs up. It makes a huge difference to my channel. I also upload a couple of videos to YouTube every week, so if you would like to get notified of that content, then don't forget to hit the subscribe and the bell button. If you are interested in following along to any of my real-time step-by-step lessons, then I'll link all of the information to those in the description below. If you do have any art-related questions, feel free to pop them in the comments. I'm more than happy to help if I can. And I'm going to be uploading another video at the end of the week, but as always, thank you so much for watching.